You've heard me interview over this year especially, men who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a man recently at our monthly men's forum, and he had served in the military, and he is now suffering with post-traumatic stress disorder, better known as PTSD. And I want to get a better understanding about it, why it happens, and how can you overcome it? Can you be cured from it completely? I have with me a military physician, Michael R. Butner, author of A Tour of Duty and professional caretaker of families dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. Michael, good morning, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. Merry Christmas to you.
And to you, too.
I read that you spent more than 40 years helping military families with post-traumatic stress disorder. Where did that name come from? When did they come up with the name post-traumatic stress disorder?
The actual name was derived by some bureaucrats during the Vietnam era. The process, it's actually not a disease. It's a normal adjustment process. It's been around forever. My grandfather was a World War I vet. Then they called it shell shock. He was a victim of that. My father grew up and served in the World War II, Korean wartime. Then it was called combat fatigue. And civilians suffer from it as much as military people do. It's a condition that is actually very, very similar, almost the same as grief. And so people have an unusual or an incorrect understanding of what the process is.
Reportedly, 7 to 8% of Americans will have PTSD at some point in their lives. Why is that?
Well, we all suffer loss. The concept that we need to understand is that whether we call it grief or whether we call it shell shock or PTSD, at different times in our life, something precious to us, something essential to us, will be taken from us. That might be the lives of our loved ones. It might be our sense of security. It might be our sense of honor or morality or justice. It can happen in combat. It can happen in natural disaster. It can happen in family settings. But when we have that taken away from us, that sense of something that is essential to our identity, we go through a type of grief and dying process. And medicine has understood what that has been about since the middle 1970s.
And so when you're going through the loss of a loved one, I'm under the impression that it should only last for a minute, a while, not the rest of your life. Is it?
No, actually, I don't mean to interrupt, but actually that's not correct. When you lose someone, it's like an amputation. Part of you is gone. And that can be a spouse, that can be a child, that can be a parent. And you adapt, and that's why we have all these social structures in our world that help us with death and dying. We call that funeral rituals, burial rituals. These things have been enshrined in antiquity as different ways we've coped with death and dying. And people understand that there are no pills for that. You have to adapt, because once you've lost your loved one, or whatever the situation is, where you've lost someone precious to you, you have to go on without that person. And the same thing happens with PTSD.
So you said that when you lose someone that's close to you like that, part of yourself is gone. I don't understand what that means, because you're not the person that you lost, that died or expired. How is part of yourself gone?
We grow up as a member of society, a member of a family, a member of a group, and we define our identities psychiatrically by our position in that group. And you are someone's spouse. You are someone's child. So part of your identity is tied into that role. when you have that person taken from you by whatever has happened, then that connection has been severed. And so part of the way you have defined yourself and the way you've interacted in your roles in your life, that has been changed. And that's what that means.
I see what you're saying. So it sounds as though you're saying that at some point we should overcome identifying with someone else, if it's our parents or our siblings or friendship. We should not identify with them, husband or wife, so when they do die, we don't feel that sense of loss where it affects us in that way, right?
Well, no, not really. I mean, when you're deeply dedicated to someone, deeply connected to someone, that's a real permanent relationship. When you have something happen to that relationship, perhaps death or disaster, or if we're talking PTSD, some sense of security that you feel, some sense of personal identity, and you've lost that, then you go through stages of adjustment. And there are 5 stages to that adjustment process. And that's how people get through and get to the other side. They have to go through these 5 stages. And those 5 stages are shock, denial, bargaining, anger or depression, and finally, if it is death and dying, it's called acceptance. And if it's PTSD, it's called self-forgiveness. And you have to get through those 5 stages. And if you don't come out on the other side as a different but more intact person.
What when men and women go into the armed forces, into the military, and they develop post-traumatic stress disorder, is that caused due to seeing your friends or close other men and women in the military that are close to you? Does that occur because you feel attached to them as well?
Yes. When you are in combat, we can talk about ideals, we can talk about patriotism, we can talk about all those concepts, but actually when you're in the field and bad things are happening, the only thing that really keeps you going is your connection to your buddies, your peers, the people who are next to you, and that's what keeps you going. And that's what you focus on. Patriotism gets down to basic things real fast when bad things are happening.
And is it a mental or emotional trauma?
It's both. It's a mental or conscious trauma because something that has been, you've had to change the way you think about things. I took care of an individual back some years ago, and he was a trained combat personnel, and the first person that he had to kill was a 9-year-old girl who was going to throw a hand grenade in the middle of his platoon. He went in to try to save, he thought, a country from communism, and in an instant, he was a murderer of a child, he thought. And his whole self-image was changed in an instant. That was both mental, his concept of himself, and emotional, the grief of seeing what had happened and seeing the child that he had just killed. So it's both things.
Yeah, that's a terrible situation. Had he not overreacted to that situation, but just did what he needed to do, not overreact, would he have developed PTSD?
People go through these stages according to one's personality type. You approach your traumas by the personality type that you have. In the military, people are defined basically as being one of 4 types of people. And those of us who do a lot of military counseling and psychiatric work recognize that. You have people who are mission-driven, and a lot of folks in the military are that. You may not understand the big picture, but your job was to get from point A to point B.
Right.
Your job was to carry the ball, carry the bomb, carry whatever from this point to that point. Those people who are very mission-driven, when they go through the adjustment process, they tend to get stuck in the denial phase, which is the second stage of PTSD. They basically, what they do is you take your emotions, you don't deal with it, you put it in somewhere in your head in a box and just keep it there and keep a lid on it and carry on with the mission.
Doctor, I want to know, first of all, how can people get your book, A Tour of Duty?
Well, it's available through Amazon or from iUniverse. So Amazon is the way people mostly get it.
Okay.
The book is self-published. I published it as a teaching tool for PTSD management.
That's good. What are the effects of those who keep a lid on their traumas and don't deal with them? Those who are stuck in phase 2 of PTSD.
What happens there most often is that people develop bad coping mechanisms. And the mechanisms that are most common for those who are stuck at that stage have to do with some sort of substance or behavioral abuse. The most common probably is alcohol, but certainly other drugs are possible. Many people who present to different care providers who don't understand the mechanism, can end up on a variety of tranquilizers and inappropriate medications. And actually what happens there is you take one bad problem, which is PTSD, and you turn it into have another problem on top of it, which may even be worse, which is substance abuse. Sometimes people develop bad behaviors. People can become workaholics. People can develop other coping mechanisms behavior-wise that are not appropriate. It's a form of denial.
Why do physicians give people with PTSD medication?
The whole concept that you have explained that in the very introduction of our conversation, people think of this as a disease, and physicians are trained to take care of diseases. If you have this problem, you take this treatment, and you're cured. Well, that's the concept that I've been working to try to explain to people, both in medical schools and medical meetings across the country for a lot of years. We have the wrong concept of this. Medicine does not expect a pill or a treatment, even electroshock therapy, to cure grief. When one loses one, as we said earlier, you have to go through an adjustment period, and you do come out on the other side if you go through all the stages, but you've lost your loved one. And the same thing happens with PTSD, but we are very much behind the curve as far as really understanding. Our concepts are wrong, and that's what I try to explain to people. We have to have a different concept. So when you have the wrong concept and you think you can cure something by treating the signs, the symptoms, you end up wrong. It's like trying to treat fever instead of the disease that causes the fever.
Is it a...
Just treat the...
Go ahead.
Well, if you end up just treating the fever, the disease goes on and people don't get well.
So, doctor, is it a physical trauma or a spiritual trauma due to an overreaction to a situation?
Again, it's both. In today's world, sometimes people are uncomfortable speaking of the spirit. I am not. It's essentially who we are. We are creatures of the spirit.
Yeah.
But we are damaged. We are one. God made us as one. We are flesh. We are spirit. We are His children. He gives us a piece of His spirit. All of that is combined into our identities, and all of it is damaged or affected.
And so if that's true, and I believe it to be more of a spiritual trauma than a physical one, why not just help them overcome it spiritually rather than, and it's, I know some professionals are doing it, giving them medications or making them feel that it's something that they would never overcome?
Well, we have, some people say we're in the post-Christian era. I hope not. But it is frequently, particularly on the media, not politically correct to speak a lot about spiritual things. Certainly medicine has been programmed. Everyone who practices medicine has been programmed not to get into spiritual things. And so there has been this disconnect that has happened in our practice of medicine where we don't pay attention to the spirit. And it's to our detriment. It's a huge fault with our system. So you can help people get through the process. The final stage of PTSD actually is self-forgiveness.
Right.
And that implies very clearly that there is a spiritual aspect to this whole process.
Do you deal with the spiritual aspect of it, or are you going the way the other doctors are going?
No, I've always tried to deal with the whole person. I try to understand if a person has spiritual connections, what their background is. Call that denomination, call it ethnicity, call it culture. God has, I think, many names and many faces, but there is one God for all of us. But he is individual for each of us, too. So I try to understand where that person's coming from with that. I don't cram religion down people's throats, but I try to help them see that that's part of who they are, and if we're going to get better, if they're going to come through this process, they need to deal with themselves as whole people. That includes the spirit.
Do you believe and have you seen men and women of PTSD overcome it completely?
Yes. The way I explain this, I use an analogy. A trained military person, a military family is where I use this analogy the most. I describe them as being iron, very strong, very durable. That the process of PTSD is like a forging fire. And when you come through it, you become steel. You actually are different, but you're stronger. You're no longer iron. You're refined into steel. You're a different person at the end, but you can be a stronger person.
How does one, you talked about self-forgiveness. What is self-forgiveness and how do you do it?
First, you have to, self-forgiveness is really what the name implies. You have to first recognize what has happened and then come to grips with that and assign guilt, honestly, to whomever the guilt is appropriate. Then approach whatever name you give God, approach God and say, this has happened. Help me, please. You have to reach beyond yourself to a higher power. And then you put it down and you get on with your life as you are then.
And have you been able to help men and women do that?
Yes. That's why I keep doing it after all these years.
That's good.
Because it's my mission and it's what I was put here to do, I believe.
Has this become more common in the last 40 years?
It's not more common, but it's much more publicized. But in the military context, you need to understand that our military world has changed. In World War II, the war lasted historically 4 years as far as our involvement was concerned. Yes, we had the post-war time. The actual combat from December 7 till the end of the combat in 45 with Japan was approximately 4 years. The Vietnam era, it depends how you want to count it, but at least 10 years. Our conflict in the Middle East seems to go on interminably, but it's over 20-some-odd years. Back in World War II time, only 10% of the armed forces saw combat. 90% were support troops. In today's world, where we have no draftees, but we have all volunteers, if you're in the Army or the Marine Corps, the odds of seeing combat are over 90%.
Amazing.
So there's more chance for this violent exposure.
Are all angry people suffering from PTSD due to an overreaction to a situation?
Well, all of us, I guess you could say it this way, all of us are going to suffer some loss and be hurt somehow or other in our lives. We don't get through life unscathed. That's what brings us to our knees and brings us back to God. The adjustment that people go through you have the 5 stages, and the second stage of that is denial. The third stage is bargaining. The fourth stage is anger. And that can be overt anger, where one is just feeling all of the bad feelings and feelings to need to lash out. But more often, anger is basically demonstrated by depression. And psychiatrists call one way to define depression is that it's anger turned inward. If someone is in a situation and the situation is unfair, it's not right, someone has been wronged, whatever that may have been, but you really can't fix it. The normal psychiatric reaction is to, after a while, a person says, well, maybe I'm the problem, and you end up blaming yourself. And that's the psychiatric definition of depression. All of us who have things happen to us are going to go through those stages, so all of us will feel anger or depression, and it's actually a normal part of life.
As you were speaking earlier, I was thinking about PTSD, and I remember I was raised by my grandparents. I remember when my grandmother expired, I was a teenager at the time, and I really took that pretty hard. It really affected me mentally and emotionally. When my father expired this year in January, and I was very close to him, extremely close to him, when he died, I didn't have a mental or emotional reaction to it, to his death, and it felt as though he had not died. Even though he had died, it didn't feel like a loss. And I realized the two differences, and maybe you can comment on this, is that when my grandmother died, I had anger. When my father died, I had no anger. I had gone to God and I had forgiven the people that I was angry at. So I had no anger. And as a result of that, when he expired, I had no physical or emotional overreaction to it. Just say I had 2 brothers to expire this year too. The same thing. So my question to you, if human beings didn't have anger, but had love, which is forgiveness, and they experienced situations in life, would they be traumatized by it?
Not nearly so much. If you would just take the word anger and substitute it and use the word pride, you're talking almost the same thing. And Scripture says, I think, somewhere in there, that the first and greatest sin was pride. And that pride and anger are all tied together. And the concept somehow is that the I becomes more important than God. I want to be in control. I want this. I want to be in control.
Yeah, they play a God.
Instead of God, and when you accept that God is in control and accept your role as His creature, and try to follow His will as best you can, then there's less anger and there's more peace. Obviously, when people die, there are violent, quick deaths that happen by our judgment at untimely times, and there are times of gentle passage when we move from this world into God's arms, and that is much easier for us to accept if you have those any type of religious feelings, because you understand that your loved one is going to basically back home, and that's not nearly it doesn't upset one the same as a violent loss.
So, if you are post-traumatic stress disorder person, the way to overcome is through forgiveness, right? Just forgive, and then you can completely overcome it and develop a sound mind and a pure heart. Am I right?
Well, the last stage of that is just what you've said, but you can't just go from point A to point E. You have to go through all the processes.
Oh, I see.
And we need human connection and spiritual connection to help us get through the process. One doesn't go from being an infant to being an adult in an instant. You go through childhood, adolescence, early adulthood to get to where you're matured. And it's the same process. This concept is the same. You have to go through the stages. what happens all too often is that if you just say, I'm going to just be okay, then actually that turns out to be a form of denial, and you're not okay. It comes back and bites you at a later point. That's why people have sometimes flashbacks. You think you're okay, but some things happen, a sound, an explosion, a vision. I saw a movie once some years ago. It's called Saving Private Ryan. And in one of those scenes, there was a combat happened between two individuals with bayonets. I know something about bayonets. I lost it. It was very embarrassing. I thought I was way past that, but that trigger came back. So it does happen. That's our human existence. So people need to understand that it's a process, and it can be started again. But if you have the right concept and the right connection to people and to God, to the Spirit, then you can go through the process much more quickly and with less trauma. You have to repeat it.
We have about a minute left. So do you have PTSD?
I have had, yes. I still do.
You still have it?
Yes. I've coped with it. It would be like saying, Dr. Butner, you were in that explosion years ago and you lost part of your leg, which I didn't, but let's say I did. So now you're 40 years past that event. How are you now? Do you have your leg back? No, I lost my leg. But I'm doing fine. You are marked by the scars of our life. But that's okay. You end up being a different and a new person.
Okay. My final segment with Dr. Michael Butner, and I really enjoyed talking to him thus far. Doctor, what's your website? Do you have a website you'd like to give out? And he's the author of A Tour of Duty, a brand new book there.
I have just moved my practice location. My website is down right now.
Oh, okay.
People can get me on my email if they want to contact me. I'm happy to give that.
Okay.
It's V as in Victor, M as in Michael, A as in Ashley, BUTNER at yahoo.com.
I just before we went to that break, I asked if you had PTSD, and you said yes. I'm getting the impression that you also believe in God, right?
Absolutely.
And do you believe that God can completely heal you of all things?
Yes.
And why haven't you overcome PTSD at this point?
Because I'm still human. I'm still on this world, and God uses us as we are. I'm submitting as best I can to His will, but I'm not perfect yet, and I won't be home until He embraces me at the end of my life. And so I still struggle some, and I struggle with my pride. I struggle with the idea that when I take care of a patient, that I am making a difference. And it's pride, because it's really God working through me. That's what makes the difference. But I struggle with my pride all the time, because I think that I can make a difference and I can make things better. Well, I can if I let God work through me. And so it's one of the struggles of my life, is to be submissive, to be respectful of God, and to not be too prideful.
Why don't you overcome the pride? Why don't you drop it and allow Him to just work through you?
Well, that's a process I've been working on for a long time, and you've spoken through the various things I've heard while I've been holding, speaking about people about anger. Some anger is a very real thing,
yeah,
and it affects us in many ways, and it's connected to our pride, to our fallen nature. Just before you came back, you were speaking to someone, I guess, about Thanksgiving and about our nature, our fallen nature. Yeah, we are a fallen race. We have required a Savior to save us. I'm very much right in the mess with everybody else. But I'm looking toward the light, and I'm still walking toward the light. And day by day, I think it's a little brighter, and things are getting better.
Do you have anger?
Of course I do.
And
I get very frustrated at things that aren't right. Trying to let it go is hard.
And what's hard about letting anger go?
again, for me, it's about the struggle with one's pride, the idea that we really
I see.
have a hard problem affecting change. Some of us, whether we're social activists, civil rights activists, you want something to be better. You want something to somehow improve. And there's an old saying which I came across that evil flourishes when good men do nothing. To be passive and do nothing is wrong. You have to be willing to be active, but still not fall prey to the anger and become a source of additional problem and conflict. And it's a dynamic balance, which is very hard in our fallen world to do. It is for me.
You know, in the scriptures it says, forgive, in the Lord's Prayer it says, forgive me as I forgive others. And for me, 28 years ago, I first forgave my parents for failing me. And when I forgave them, meaning that I went to them and apologized for being angry at them, and that's what forgiveness is. And when I forgave them, God forgave me, and he took away completely that spirit of anger, and I no longer have it. And since that point, I've been able to deal with and overcome major issues in life because I see that it's a spiritual thing. It's a battle between good and evil, and on myself, I can do nothing about it. So I'm not mad at what I go through. And so far, I've been able to overcome all things. And so why not forgive so that God can forgive you and he can take that spirit of anger away from you?
Well, the concept that you have is that you've reached this point and that then things are completed. And I compliment you on hitting that point in your life. And I'm amazed by it. Sometimes people that you need to have the interaction with are no longer with us. You may be the sole survivor. You may have your family members have already passed on, the ones that you're angry with.
Well, they don't have to be. They don't have to be alive. Once you get to know yourself, and you see what drives you, and that something else is causing you to do the things you don't want to do, and preventing you from doing the things that you want to do, it helps you to realize that your parents and other people had that same spirit, and that's why they did to you what they did to you. They couldn't help it. And when you realize that, it causes you to forgive them, and in that very moment, God will forgive you. They don't have to be around.
I appreciate you saying that. Thank you for the counsel.
Does it make sense?
Sure, it does.
Will you try that?
I've been trying it for a long time, and we'll get there by and by, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's real easy. Just get to know, because there are things you have done in life, just as I had done, that I wish I had not done, and I didn't want someone to be mad at me about it because I couldn't help myself. Well, everybody's going through that same thing, and that's what caused forgiveness. Doctor, it's been like more than a notion talking to you. I'm glad that I've had this conversation with you.
Thank you for your time also, and I wish you well and all of your folks that you take care of.
Yes, sir, and I wish you well with your book. Be safe out there.
All right, thank you.